Welcome to you all to this virtual commemoration of the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, celebrated globally every year on the 9th of August. I'm just going to give a minute for everybody to start connecting because it takes a while for everybody to get the connection. And I'd also like to say we're doing Facebook live streaming as well. So welcome, just give it a minute. Okay, so my name is Rosemary Lane, and I am Acting Chief of the Indigenous Peoples and Development Branch of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs at the United Nations in New York. We're delighted that you're able to join us from around the world for this year's special theme on the role of Indigenous women in the preservation and transmission of traditional knowledge. Before we begin the event, let me share with you some practical issues on how we'll proceed. The event is being webcasted through the Permanent Forum's Facebook and Twitter accounts, so please feel free to share the live stream with your networks. And for those who are unable to join us live, the event will also be recorded and uploaded onto the website. We have simultaneous interpretation from English to Spanish available and vice versa. I also invite you to use the official hashtag Indigenous Day, as well as the We Are Indigenous, to join the conversation happening online. As you know, the International Day is officially commemorated on the 9th of August each year in recognition of the first meeting of the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous Populations in Geneva in 1982. High-level officials within the United Nations system recognize the significance of this day for Indigenous peoples. Therefore, the Secretary General, the Director General of the World Health Organization, and the Chair of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues will address the event with pre-recorded messages, which we will run now. Thank you.
On this year's International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, we are highlighting the role of Indigenous women in preserving and passing on traditional knowledge. Indigenous women are knowledge keepers of traditional food systems and medicines. They are champions of Indigenous languages and cultures. They defend the environment and Indigenous peoples' human rights. To build an equitable and sustainable future that leaves no one behind, we must amplify the voices of Indigenous women. Indigenous traditional knowledge can offer solutions to many of our common challenges. On my recent visit to Suriname, I learned firsthand how Indigenous peoples are protecting their rainforests and its rich biodiversity. On this International Day, I call on member states to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and to promote Indigenous traditional knowledge for the benefit of all.
Dear colleagues and friends, I thank the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs and the Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues for inviting WHO to this event. Indigenous peoples, and particularly Indigenous women, are vital gatekeepers of health for their communities. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples safeguards the right to health without discrimination, while also highlighting their right to traditional medicines and health practices. Indigenous peoples also have unique knowledge and experience in traditional medicine, food systems, and a One Health approach that encompasses the health of humans, animals, and our environment. And yet, Indigenous peoples continue to face barriers to accessing health services and are often underserved by health programs, strategies, and plans. It's essential for all countries to lift up the voices of indigenous peoples in the design and delivery of health policies and services. WHO is committed to supporting countries to protect and promote the health of indigenous peoples, as demonstrated by our recent engagement with the Interagency Support Group on Indigenous Issues. On this International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, we celebrate their rich heritage and we commit to working for a rich future, a healthier, safer, and fairer future for all indigenous peoples. I thank you.
Hoy conmemoramos el Día Internacional de los Pueblos Indígenas del Mundo. Para mí es un honor poder participar en este evento y saludarles de manera muy especial. Hace 30 años, la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas decidió que el 9 de agosto de cada año se conmemoraría este Día Internacional. Esta es una ocasión para que los estados, el sistema de las Naciones Unidas, la sociedad civil y los pueblos indígenas evaluemos si después de la adopción de la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas vamos por buen camino. El próximo mes de septiembre, la declaración cumplirá 15 años de haberse adoptado en la ONU. Sin embargo, vemos cómo la xenofobia, las crecientes amenazas a los defensores indígenas de los derechos humanos y del medio ambiente, el aumento de la violencia contra dirigentes indígenas, incluidas las mujeres y niñas indígenas, los conflictos por las tierras, por los recursos, siguen siendo pan de cada día y se recrudecen en los territorios. Estas amenazas están cada vez más interrelacionadas y la propaganda y los medios de comunicación nos están distanciando. Los pueblos indígenas no somos los enemigos internos. La pobreza, el racismo, la marginación y la exclusión sí lo son, y han estado ahí desde los tiempos de la colonización. Por eso el diálogo y el trabajo conjunto debe estar presente en todo momento y en todo lugar. Las mujeres indígenas nos han demostrado con creces cada vez que son quienes toman las riendas de las iniciativas colectivas por la defensa de nuestras tierras, los territorios y la reivindicación de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas en todas las regiones del mundo. Sus conocimientos codificados en las lenguas y muchas veces que no son escritos de generación en generación, sino que se transmite de manera oral, que van desde las prácticas, el uso de los recursos, los rituales, la espiritualidad y las visiones del mundo. Por ejemplo, las mujeres indígenas reproducen y protegen la identidad, la cultura y los valores de los pueblos indígenas. Sus conocimientos científicos son fundamentales para crear soluciones a los conflictos, buscar justicia, para abordar el cambio climático y proteger la biodiversidad. Son inmensamente creativas para afrontar retos únicos, como lo han demostrado durante la pandemia y otros fenómenos externos. Paradójicamente, por estar en primera línea en los asuntos comunitarios y por abordar las soluciones con fórmulas concretas, también están en la primera línea a la hora de recibir los impactos negativos a los que se enfrentan los pueblos indígenas en distintas partes del mundo. En el día de hoy, en la conmemoración del Día Internacional de los Pueblos Indígenas, el Foro Permanente para las Cuestiones Indígenas reconoce y saluda a la inmensa cantidad de lideresas y hermanas indígenas a quienes se les dedica esta conmemoración con el tema el papel de las mujeres indígenas en la preservación y transmisión de los conocimientos tradicionales. Estimadas hermanas, el Foro Permanente reconoce las perspectivas únicas y las necesidades específicas de las mujeres indígenas, por lo cual da prioridad a los derechos de las mujeres indígenas en sus sesiones anuales y desde siempre ha defendido a través de sus recomendaciones la búsqueda de acciones concretas para incluir sus derechos y perspectivas en los principales marcos intergubernamentales. El foro será siempre el espacio para que ustedes denuncien, propongan, pero sobre todo siempre buscará que sus voces y perspectivas únicas sean respondidas. En este Día Internacional reiteramos el llamado a los estados a tomar medidas concretas para aumentar la participación de las mujeres indígenas en la toma de decisiones en todos los niveles sobre los asuntos que le competen a los pueblos indígenas y a las sociedades donde viven. Pero sobre todo, llamamos a los profesionales, científicos, responsables políticos, a reconocer que los conocimientos y prácticas ancestrales vigentes son un aporte valioso para la solución de problemas mundiales contemporáneos, por lo cual es menester impulsar el diálogo intercultural siempre y en todo momento. Muchas gracias.
Before starting, I would firstly like to invite our distinguished guest, Ms. Casey Camp-Horinek, to open the panel with a traditional ceremony and land acknowledgement. Ms. Camp-Horinek is an elder of the Ponca Nation of Oklahoma here in the USA and has been at the forefront of grassroots efforts to educate and empower Indigenous peoples on environmental and civil rights issues. Ms. Horinek, I give you the floor.
Wibdaha, Datia, Ijiji Witike, Panka Abdi, Mashte Panka, Oklahoma. Good morning, my friends and relatives. I thank you for the opportunity to come together with you this morning. And everywhere we are, on the face of our Mother the Earth, underneath the Father Sky, and above the fires that lit in the earth, we've come together on a day today to be able to make the full acknowledgement of the gifts that the Indigenous people still carry within our spirits and within our understandings of our connections with all that is in all directions. Where I live here in north central Oklahoma, we are part of a forest removal people. Our original territories is in the northern part of Turtle Island, or now called the United States. It will acknowledge the Wichita people, the Caddo people who lived here before me, and wherever you may be, please reach into the deepest portions of yourself and the roots that you have to acknowledge those that came before you. It's our way and it's our understanding that without those that came before us, we wouldn't exist. And it is our duty and our honor to care for those who are coming after us. Recently in our territory, we have been active in bringing about the original teachings of our people into active laws that are being made within our tribal structure. As a colonized people, we've had to follow the laws of the United States. But within our immutable laws are the laws of nature, that we recognize that we are not separate from nature, but we are part of nature. And when we see the world as it is today, we recognize that these voices that are now coming to the forefront on days like today are because of that relationship that has to be acknowledged. When the United States is being asked to declare a climate emergency, it's because those have not listened to the voices of the Indigenous people until now. and that the wisdom that comes from our traditional knowledge is a way forward for all people, for all animals, for all birds, for all living things with roots in the ground, for the air herself, for the water. We have passed the rights of the river statute in our territory that recognizes that the rivers have their own life, and that with her life, she sustains life here. With that, I want to take a moment and ask you to join me. It used to be in our times of travel where we would go into one another's territory and sit around a campfire, drink water together, and share the sacred spirit of all that is, and be able to communicate with one another what would be best for our people, for the ones that live around us, that we're part of. Today, we come together in these spaces, these Zoom calls, these computers that many of us learned in an elder age. And in that way, I want to speak in this language that is common in the world today, this English language. And I ask you to join your spirits with mine as we begin to come into a day that was inevitable with the way that mankind, humankind, has been treating our Mother Earth, our Father Sky. It was inevitable that she would have to step up and enter into this time of purification, our Mother Earth, in conjunction with Father, Sun, Moon, Mother, winds, and waters, in order to bring back balance to where we are right now. And as human beings, my prayer today will be that we rejoin as a species, as a human species, with all of those sacred beings that still understand balance. Dari Wakanda, Wakanda Hube, Wibda Ehe, Wibda Hami, Miamba, Ni, Shingajinga, Tiga, Gaham, Dak de Te, He, Wakanda, Great Spirit, Manjan Hube, Sacred Mother. Today, when we come, we want to honor the true powers that sustain life. Our Father, the Sun, our Mother, the Moon, the sacred waters herself, the wondrous earth that sustains us. We look to the West in our ways, and we honor those through the sacred pipe that represent the Thunder Nation with the water, the fire, and the air, all combined on the wings of an eagle. We ask that you look our way, and that you bless us with the understandings of the powers and the beauty that you share here on earth, even as the winds grow stronger in cleansing, even as the droughts grow stronger and the floods, and all of those things that are part of this rebalancing. To the west, we ask your blessing. Above us, to the north, the white wolf that brings the cool, icy air and the cold winds. We ask for your renewed strength, as we know that you're suffering from this carbon and those things that cause unnatural warming for the relatives that live up there. We ask that your strength grow, and that somehow we're able to contribute to the healing of where you are, sacred white wolf, and that you continue to bless us with strong winters and good ways that are part of the balancing. To the east, morning star, as we woke up this morning, and you gave us the wisdom to get up and make our morning prayers, and our Father Sun rose on this day and gave us an opportunity to have a day to share, to be able to honor you as you have honored us with many days, that we can make what it is that needs to be made that day. We thank you for all that you offer to us. We ask you to help us to rejoin into the natural laws, the natural ways, and to overcome the obstacles that we have put in our own ways through the laws of man. To the south, to the relatives that live there and the warm winds that come from that direction, here where we live on Turtle Island, we thank you for the warmth and the growth. We thank you for the valleys and the hills and the greens and all of those ones that sustain us and all of those that sustain life on earth from those warm winds, those warm places, and even all the way down to that Arctic Circle that must be protected, that must be honored and cherished. We thank you for everything in that direction from wherever we are on our Mother Earth right now. Above us, Wakanda, Star Nation, Moon Mother, wings, creepy crawlers that take flight, all those that help us to live in balance. We need your help more than ever at this time to be able to help sustain a balancing here on earth that takes us forward and gives us direction as it always has in the past. Lift our minds, lift our hearts, lift our spirits to look above and to gain our balance with seeing the ways that the stars move again and to understand how impactful every movement here on earth is. Earth Mother, when we look below, we see the roots firmly in the ground. We know the importance of the sacred corn, of the sacred trees, of every blade of grass, of every creepy crawler, everything that burrows deep into the core where the fire lives. We understand that because of your love, your nurturing, your believing in our ability to come back into balance, that you have sustained humankind. We ask at this time through your sacred waters, through all the living things, even the stone people, that we too awaken ourselves into the original ways of our ancestors, and that you join us together as one in this sacred web of life that we all participate in. As we humans look into all directions, all 6 directions, and honor the winds that blow, that connect us, we ask you to help us understand how to bring in the sacred feminine into the sacred masculine energies that are part of this way that the universe was originally created by the great mystery. Give us guidance, join us together, open our minds, hearts, spirits, and beings to the reality of how to go forward. We have generations to come that we must protect and make way for. We give great love today to our elders, to those who are sickly, to those who are hungry and homeless, to those things that we may not have said their names and their beings. We ask you to overlook us, but to join all that is in one sacred prayer of gratefulness for the lives that we have today. Wibdaha Shah. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Ms. Camp-Horinek, for your inspiring opening ceremony and very powerful words. Thank you so much for being with us. And now it's my pleasure to open the panel discussion on the theme of the role of Indigenous women in the preservation and transmission of traditional knowledge. This panel discussion has been organized by the Indigenous Peoples and Development Branch in the Division for Inclusive Social Development of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs at the United Nations. During the panel session, each speaker will be invited one at a time to respond to 2 questions to this year's theme, specific to their area of expertise. After all their interventions, we'll invite each speaker to respond to a more general question and to make concluding remarks. Please note that we will not have an interaction Q&A session. However, we do invite you to be active online and share your thoughts with us by logging on to our social media handle, UN4Indigenous, and by using the hashtags WeAreIndigenous and Indigenous Day in your posts. Also, at the end of the panel session, we will also invite you to participate in a word cloud presentation by Mentimeter, so that we can hear your thoughts and reflection on today's discussions. We'll also share a compilation video at the end of today's event of those who shared with us their stories of the Indigenous women who inspire them. So I am delighted today to welcome the Indigenous women leaders in our panel session. Our invited speakers are Ms. Achana Sareng, climate activist and member of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on climate change, Ms. Ali Keskitalo, former president of the Norwegian Sami Parliament, and Ms. Zaki Yatu Walet Halatin, former Minister of Tourism and Handicrafts from Mali. We also have a video intervention from Ms. Hannah McGlade, a member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And I'd also like to welcome Ambassador Diego Pari Rodriguez, who's the permanent representative of Bolivia to the United Nations in New York. The ambassador will be listening keenly to today's panel discussions and will provide a commentary on his reflections and thoughts afterwards. It's a pleasure to have you all with us, and thank you for commemorating the International Day with us today. Our panel speakers today will share their expertise and experience from their Indigenous communities in preserving, reviving, retaining, and transmitting the traditional knowledge in their various fields, including on sustainable climate solutions, the protection of biodiversity and food security, promoting Indigenous languages and culture, and sharing Indigenous scientific and medicinal knowledge. Thank you to each of you for sharing your time and expertise with all of us today, and we're looking forward to an enlightening and enriching discussion. So that being said, our first panel member, Achana Sareng. I'm turning to Arantxa to speak about the environment and climate. As I said, Arantxa Sareng is from the Kharia peoples in Odisha, India. Ms. Sareng is a member of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on climate change. She is an experienced advocate in working to document, preserve, and promote traditional knowledge and cultural practices. So you have the floor.
Johar, everyone, and wishing you all a happy International Day of World's Indigenous People. As we talk about role of women in transmission and preservation of the traditional knowledge and practices, I would like to emphasize that Indigenous women have been the pivotal role in terms of holding our communities together. They are the ones who have been contributing immensely towards the climate action, towards biodiversity conservation, and have been taking care of the community with care. Indigenous women are the foundation of Indigenous communities. Indigenous women have been leading the way in terms of taking care of nature. However, we see that Indigenous women have been facing several challenges. I would like to emphasize 3 challenges with Indigenous women are facing at the moment is inferiorization of our identity and culture and tradition has been one of the key major challenges. Over the years, Indigenous women and Indigenous communities have been looked down because of their culture, tradition, language, and food systems. It is only now that the world is starting to recognize the contribution of Indigenous communities, the contribution of Indigenous women towards climate action, food system rejuvenation, and biodiversity conservation. This needs to come from a place of respect. This needs to come from a place of undoing the injustices done to the communities, and pushing forward and advocating for meaningful leadership and participation of Indigenous people and local communities, and also ensuring that there is safe and enabling spaces for Indigenous communities, specifically women and young people. We also see that there has been gross human rights violation of Indigenous communities and specifically women and youth. I remember the Indigenous ancestors, women and youth who have lost their life in advocating for our rights, identity, culture, tradition, language, and food systems. The marginalization of Indigenous communities and Indigenous worldview needs to stop. We need to respect Indigenous people, their traditional knowledge and practices and worldview. For us, Indigenous communities, nature is a source of identity, culture, tradition, and language, unlike other communities who see nature as a commercial commodity. In our worldview, we are not mere part of nature, but we are nature. Indigenous people should be leaders of climate actions and not victims of climate policies. Hence, we need more representation of Indigenous women, Indigenous youth in the decision-making spaces of climate policies, biodiversity conservation, ecosystem restoration. We together can work towards attaining Paris Agreement goals and sustainable development goals.
Thank you very much for outlining those challenges that you're seeing as a member of the SG's Youth Advisory Group on climate change. And just I'd like to ask you a follow-up question. Could you identify how Indigenous traditional knowledge has contributed to climate change solutions and has been passed on to younger generations? Thank you.
Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous communities' traditional knowledge and practices plays a pivotal role in terms of climate action, biodiversity conservation, and ecosystem restoration. Indigenous communities, through the worldview, have a very intrinsic relationship with nature. Indigenous communities, through the governance institutions, have been contributing and protecting the nature and the forest and the land. Indigenous communities, through the eco-friendly practices, have been contributing towards climate action. I would like to emphasize, when we are talking about plastic pollution, Indigenous communities have been practicing alternatives to it, such as making leaf plates, instead of plastic cutleries, which can be a solution towards plastic crisis or plastic pollution. Indigenous communities have community-led forest protection practices, water rejuvenation practices, and also have eco-friendly practices in terms of the organic farming, sustainable agriculture, sustainable and organic food practices. These have been contributing towards ecosystem restoration and climate action. Moreover, I feel Indigenous communities' worldview, Indigenous communities' traditional knowledge and practices have been transmitted to the upcoming generation through language. And that's why it's really critical to preserve Indigenous language. And Indigenous women are holders and keepers of these traditional knowledge and these languages. And it is really important to understand that Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous language are intertwined. Indigenous language is also holders of Indigenous knowledge. And that's why I feel it's really important to understand that our culture, tradition, history, and languages is also embedded in our language, which is also embedded in our stories, songs, folklores. And that's why I feel it's really critical to support Indigenous peoples' preservation of the traditional knowledge and practices. And most importantly, it's very important to recognize the rights of Indigenous people over the land, forest, and territories, because failing to have this leads to loss of their identity, culture, tradition, and language, and they're pushed towards migration. And also there has been immense evidences of displacement because of loss of their because of displacement, which has led to loss of the traditional knowledge and practices. So it's a vicious circle of recognizing and respecting and promoting the traditional knowledge and practices of Indigenous communities, their rights, and working towards climate action and ecosystem restoration.
Thank you very much, Archana, for this really interesting intervention, and good luck in your work on the SG's Youth Advisory Group, which is really important. We're so happy that there's an Indigenous representative on that panel, so thank you. I'd now like to move to our next panel member, who will look at Indigenous languages. Miss Aili Keskitahalo is served as the president of the Sami Parliament for 3 terms between 2005 and 2021. She served as the co-chair of the steering committee of the organization of the International Year of Indigenous Languages in 2019, and continues to play an instrumental role in the International Decade on Indigenous Languages, which was launched this year and will run through 2032. And we posed a question to her, which was that in preparing for the International Decade on Indigenous Languages, could you explain why Indigenous languages are so important in transmitting and ensuring the vitality of Indigenous cultures and knowledge and values? Ali, over to you.
Ivy, good day. It is important to understand that the Indigenous peoples' languages are not only a question of communication. Our mother tongues are intertwined with identity, cultural heritage, and our sense of belonging to a community, to a landscape, and to a people. Our languages are archives that document our knowledge. Our languages are vessels that carry our values. Our languages express our understanding of ourselves and the world we live in. Without our languages, our distinct cultures will slowly wither away, and we will be assimilated into the mainstream societies. This would be a tragedy for our peoples, but also for the world. A lost language means the loss of a distinct system of thinking and relating to the world. And for me, the Sami language is like a sinew that tie me to our common Sami heritage, to our ancestors. It is a sad fact that many Indigenous peoples and individuals, these sinews have been torn because of colonialism, because of displacement, forced assimilation, and attempts on cultural genocide. What I want to stress is that these sinews can be mended. Imagine an Indigenous mother carefully sewing together what have been torn. It is hard work, and she might not have much help, but she's doing it anyway, out of love of our culture and the love of her children. Never underestimate the power of a loving mother. She should not have to do this alone. So let us together demand that she gets the help she needs and deserves. And this is why the International Decade of Indigenous Languages represents such a great opportunity to raise awareness of the need for support for Indigenous languages. Indigenous peoples' languages need supportive legislation, supportive policies and resources, because the pressures on our languages are immense. My hope is that the decade will provide both visibility and concrete action in support of Indigenous peoples' languages on community level, but also on state and international level.
Thank you. And I have a follow-up question. How in particular are Indigenous women leading the way in strengthening Indigenous language, Alili?
Keitu, thank you. In my experience, Indigenous women are leading the way in several different ways when it comes to strengthening our languages. In grassroots activities in our communities, as language activists on social media, in academia as language scholars, as teachers, as artists and cultural influencers, as providers of public services, as elders and protectors of Indigenous knowledge, and as policymakers on different levels. This is true in the Sami communities, but I have both visited and shared experiences with other Indigenous women, and it seems to me that we Indigenous women take upon us a great responsibility in safeguarding our languages. And to me personally, motherhood was a defining experience for my relationship with my language. I had to make a personal decision to bring back the Sami language in my family line. My greatest joy in life is hearing my 3 daughters speaking Sami between them. It gives me hope for the future, for our people and our languages. And giving our children the gift of our languages is the single most important language strengthening that we can do as women or as humans. Keitu, thank you.
Thank you, Aili, for that really interesting intervention. And we all hope at the beginning of this decade that we'll have a really, not just positive, but really, practical outcome, as you said, in promoting the use and the preservation of Indigenous languages, which is so important, as you say. So thank you very much for that intervention. Our third panelists will address the topic of Indigenous culture and science. And I'm going to introduce Ms. Zakiutu Walet Halatin. And Ms. Walet Halatin is a Tuareg from Mali and served as the Minister of Tourism and Handicrafts in the government of Mali from 2000 to 2002. She's an engineer by education, and she's a respected writer and scholar of the Tuareg culture and traditional scientific knowledge, and is currently a scholar of the Sorbonne University in Paris. So the question we pose to you is, from your experience, could you share with us the main challenges that the Tuareg have faced with your Indigenous traditional knowledge has been misappropriated? So over to you, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Lynn. First, allow me to thank you and your colleague, Mrs. Kentish, Abubakrin, and Martin, for this invitation. And let me wish for everyone a happy Indigenous Day. For decades, the Tuareg Indigenous knowledge has faced several threats and have been profoundly disrupted. On the one hand, lack of researchers and well-adjusted policies. On the other hand, severe droughts, violent armed conflicts resulting in numerous deaths, insecurity, poverty, and forced migrations. Knowledge bearers were often targeted. Many were killed or were fled. Many traditional knowledge bearers disappear with their knowledge. What a sad and tragic loss of cultural heritage and wisdom. In exile, Tuareg Indigenous knowledge faces new threats. The ties between those forced into exile and their geographic and human environment are stretched, if not disrupted. Also, this knowledge may appear as of little relevance to their host environment. Insufficient mastery and uncritical acceptance of Indigenous knowledge result in its essentialization and its loss of resilience and capacity for searching and finding solutions to the problems of a never-changing life. In other words, it obscures the open, dynamic, and necessarily hybrid character of this knowledge. Last, abroad as well as at home, there is a sad lack of engaged and competent researchers able to translate indigenous knowledge to make it accessible and show its relevance to the present. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I had a follow-up question, which is, what would you recommend to multi-stakeholders who wish to meaningfully engage and partner with Indigenous peoples on the use of traditional medicine?
Thank you, Madam Len. I recommend supporting process restoring peace and security, livelihoods and social capital in areas where Indigenous people are struggling to survive. Specifically, I recommend promoting Indigenous knowledge not only has a cultural heritage, but also has a collective wisdom and capacity for searching solutions and a means of empowerment. This would include protection of traditional knowledge and its bearers in city as well in extreme conditions such as displacement, exile, and war. I recommend a competent cultural translation of Indigenous traditional medicine knowledge, showing not only recipes, but the whole philosophy behind this knowledge, beliefs, myths, and so on. I recommend empowering bearers of this knowledge. I recommend also promoting exchanges between Indigenous knowledge bearers and others to ensure the sharing of knowledge and the resilience of Indigenous knowledge. In this spirit, I worked on 8 publications between 213 and 222. 3 books were on a special request of 2 well-known members of an important Tuareg community in the Tombouctou region in northern Mali. Fadi Walid Faki, first a woman, traditional therapist, introduced more than 130 diseases and corresponding traditional therapeutic solutions, including 47 rituals and 118 materials such as trees, plants, mineral, and animal products, of which 70% find no corresponding in consulted literature. Fadi also recalled in this book samples of effective, sustainable land management tied to the climate, the protection of biodiversity, use of natural resources, and the guarantee of food security. While working on creating a gateway for the transmission of sharing and of traditional medicine knowledge, Fadi said to me, write it so the United Nations knows what's going on here. She said to me. That day, I smiled, thinking that will never happen. See, I was wrong because message is now delivered. The second person was Mohamed El Mehdi Gataher and Namanukal, the chief. He introduced the social, political, economic history of their land, spoke about the traditional links between his community and other Sahelian neighboring communities during pre-colonial and colonial times. He explained foundation that tied his ancestral community, that is the non-violence sermon, and the rejection of the accumulation of evil gold. My personal research experience show that structures and founding are crucial, but quality and diversity of researchers is essential. Allow me, Mrs. Len, to thank in this occasion the Université Panthéon-Sorbonne, the Programme National Pause, and Institut du Monde Africain in France, as well as the Arctic University of Tromsø in Norway, and their respective referents, Mr. Clay, Laurent Jaffreau, Pierre Boilet, Laura Loic, Trondvag, as well as the researchers that contributed to the above-mentioned scientific work, including Mr. André Marty. I worked with him on the tambour suspendu. Professor Barbara Fiore, Dr. Jean Gosgen, Ibrahim Agyusuf, and Perrine Pinheiro. They contributed to the work entitled Maladie et soins en milieu Touareg, and Michel Poulton, a former administrator of Save the Children, and Professor Patricia Kemmens from VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University in USA, that translated the book named Passion du Désert in English. Thank you.
Thank you very much for bringing these particular issues from your region, from Mali, to this event and highlighting the really, I know, the importance of Indigenous scientific knowledge and the promotion of that knowledge. And it is scientific knowledge, and I think that's really important. And also bringing up the issue of peace and security as well, which is particularly important, in the role of women in peace and security. So I thank you very much, Ms. Wallet Halatine, for bringing that. And I would like to follow up with a general question to all of you. I thank all of you for providing the invaluable insights on these issues. And it's clear that Indigenous women, such as yourselves, among many others, are key actors in preserving traditional knowledge in a wide range of topics, as we've seen. And it's crucial for others, including stakeholders, member states, and UN institutions, to engage meaningfully with Indigenous women in order to promote the transmission of traditional knowledge and to uphold the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I'd like now to ask one final question to all of you in the panel discussion, and each of you will have 1 minute to respond. And so the question is, how can Indigenous traditional knowledge collaborate with other forms of knowledge systems on an equal footing to find solutions to the current challenges facing humanity? And I'll turn over first in the order we spoke in, which is Archana. I'll give the floor to you first. Thank you.
I feel it comes from a place of respect. And I would again re-emphasize it, like respecting the traditional knowledge and practices of Indigenous communities. And then willingness to work together will make difference. So it's all about coming from a place of respect, solidarity, and the willingness to work together needs to come from a space where you're looking us at an equal level and not a level of, we as an imposition level or looking us as an inferior communities. So I think Indigenous knowledge and other form of knowledge can go hand in hand if there's mutual respect and if there is solidarity and where there is enabling spaces and participation, where how we can make sure that which element of traditional knowledge, which element of other forms of knowledge needs to be combined, how we need to come together. So which again brings down to me to emphasize on intergenerational dialogue and intergenerational dialogue of different stakeholders coming together and leaving no one behind, and emphasizing that these conversations are also having linguistic diversities, because often because of language barriers, communities are not being able to access the spaces. So I would like to summarize and say that mutual respect and willingness to work together will make difference. And we as Indigenous communities, as Indigenous young women, we are willing to work together with you to work towards climate action, ecosystem restoration, and biodiversity conservation. And at the end, I would like to say that we all have space and we all can have the opportunity to come together to work towards it. It's just we need to lend our hands to each other and hold tight together and work in solidarity where we are pushing forward for justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Achana. And Aili, over to you. I think you're on mute, Aili. Thank you.
Keito, can you hear me now? Thank you. To follow up on what Archana Soreng just said, I think the indigenous knowledge that is carried in our languages could assist us in dealing with global issues like the climate and the environmental crisis that we are facing. To secure a living heritage and to secure biodiversity. But that would demand willingness to listen to indigenous voices that we have yet to see from world leaders. So somewhat more achievable would be to further explore what the digitalization and what technological development could mean to our languages. I believe that language technology offers new opportunities to teaching, to documenting, and to using our languages on new arenas. If it is based on the needs and the consent from indigenous peoples ourselves, then digitalization could create better conditions for access to information, for freedom of expression, and for artistic development. Indigenous peoples have the same need for and the same right to digital empowerment as the rest of the world. And who knows, maybe that could strengthen our voices to be heard on important issues facing the world, like climate change. Keito, thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And finally, I'll give the floor to Zakiatu to respond to the same questions. So you have the floor.
Thank you, Mrs. Lane. Following my predecessor, I would like to underline that isolation is very deadly for knowledge systems. There is a need for an open-minded cultural translation of indigenous knowledge based on the recognition of the need for cultural diversity. I recommend following: allowing bearers of indigenous knowledge to participate in research and development programs, in seminar and other exchange mechanisms. Protecting the bearers of traditional knowledge, including those in exile, and specific attention should be paid to indigenous women as they are central part of the knowledge and the life of indigenous communities. Women are the gateways between families, clans, and societies. Partnership between indigenous people, their communities, organizations, and members with states, private sector, development partners, scientists, should be on a mutual respect basis and on a win-win basis. Respect for diversity is a duty. It's also a responsibility. Then no country should be exempted from its duty to protect its own indigenous people. It is also important that private sector and states should be brought to acknowledge their responsibility and contribute to the endeavor of the international community through specific efforts. It could be taxes, donation, or so on. Last, on my view, it is also important that the Human Development Index should include a consideration of indigenous knowledge protection and protection of its bearers from abuse and neglect at home as well as in exile. I thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those closing remarks by our three panelists. And so before closing this panel discussion and handing over to our commentator, His Excellency Harry Rodriguez, I would like first to present a video statement from a member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, Ms. Hannah McGlade. Dr. McGlade is a legal expert on the rights of Indigenous women and girls and has a wealth of experience at international mechanisms relating to the rights of Indigenous peoples. So here is Dr. Hannah McGlade.
Kaya, I'm Hannah McGlade from the Bibbulmun people of Western Australia. This year's theme for World Indigenous Peoples Day is the role of Indigenous women in the preservation and transmission of traditional knowledge. International Indigenous Peoples Day commemorates the date of the first meeting in 1982 of the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations that led the way in developing the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Indigenous women have been advocates and contributors, leaders since the very first year of the Working Group on Indigenous Populations in 1982 in Geneva, Switzerland. Indigenous women were active participants in the 2 decades of negotiations for the Declaration adopted by the General Assembly in September 2007. I honour all Indigenous women who led the way in fighting for the recognition of our rights at the UN, especially our mothers, sisters and aunties who are no longer with us. They ensured Indigenous women would always be recognised as upholding our rights, fighting all forms of discrimination that exist within nation states. Indigenous women were subjected to patriarchal cultures that denigrated Indigenous cultures and perpetrated racial abuse and violence towards Indigenous women and girls. This history has not ceased and is evidenced by the very high levels of violence, including murder, that Indigenous women and girls experience today. In the face of this, Indigenous women are ensuring transmission of culture for future generations, knowing actions undertaken today affect all our descendants. Indigenous women have significant knowledge of land and biodiversity and are guardians of Indigenous knowledge, with responsibility to protect and teach children and youth. Indigenous traditional knowledge is the body of knowledge, practice and belief handed down through generations by cultural transmission and concerns the relationship of Indigenous people with one another and with the environment. The world is now recognising the importance of Indigenous traditional knowledge in climate mitigation, and Indigenous women and girls must be treated as equal partners in the fight against climate change. Around the world, Indigenous women are leading the way in caring for country and protecting sacred lands, knowing that land is our mother. In my Noongar language in Australia, mother and son are the one and same word, nyak, signifying the interrelationship of women with land and environment. We are the daughters of Mother Earth, obligated to take care of the earth and its resources. Unfortunately, women's rightful role in land preservation is often unrecognised and overlooked, placing at risk Indigenous lands and cultures. In this decade of Indigenous languages, Indigenous women are at the forefront of revitalising and maintaining Indigenous languages. The Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues urges states to increase their commitment towards Indigenous languages in schools and immersion programs. Indigenous women have traditional healing knowledge, passed from generations. The Western health systems must recognise traditional Indigenous healers and traditional medicines. Our healers from Central Australia are called the Ngangkari, and they are renowned for their traditional healing practices. With Indigenous suicide on the rise, including suicide of women and girls, governments should recognise that our own healing practices can be more effective in helping our communities. The recent report of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Reem Al-Salam, on violence against Indigenous women and girls, importantly recognises the complex nature of violence against Indigenous women, including state violence and environmental violence. This report must not be forgotten by the UN, which itself too has often marginalised our voices. We are not invisible women. We are the First Nations women of our lands, and our cultural survival also depends on states' increased commitment to ending violence. We also look forward to and acknowledge CEDAW for their work in developing the first recommendation on the rights of Indigenous women, influenced by the advocacy and commitment of Indigenous women of the South Americas for many years. We must increase our attention to Indigenous women's human rights and progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals and SDG 5, achieving gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls. The acknowledgement of Indigenous women's role in the transmission and preservation of traditional knowledge is critical to the realisation of Indigenous rights and states' responsibilities to protect those rights. Indigenous women and girls cannot be left behind. I thank you and acknowledge the UN agencies and their critical role, including today's important recognition of Indigenous women and cultural survival on World Indigenous Peoples Day.
I would like to now to invite His Excellency Ambassador Diego Pari Rodriguez, Permanent Representative of Bolivia to the United Nations, to provide a commentary on the panel session. And thank you for being with us today. So I hand over the floor to you, Your Excellency.
Muchísimas gracias. Un privilegio poder participar de esta importante celebración del Día Internacional de los Pueblos Indígenas. Saludo a Rosemary Elaine, nuestra moderadora. Saludo a cada una de nuestras panelistas. Pues les decía en quechua, es una alegría para mí poder participar de este panel y comparto con ustedes, saludo a ustedes por estar presentes acá. Destaco esas poderosas palabras de nuestras panelistas, de quienes con mucha fuerza han expresado su visión y la experiencia que cada uno de los pueblos indígenas a lo largo del planeta ha ido desarrollando. En ese sentido, creo que es importante destacar que las mujeres indígenas mantienen vivo el conocimiento tradicional y ancestral, y esto no debe hacernos olvidar que ellas se encuentran también a la vanguardia de la lucha colectiva por los derechos indígenas y los derechos de la madre tierra. Las mujeres indígenas son protectoras de la madre tierra, son quienes constantemente conviven en el día a día con la madre tierra, y estos conocimientos también se transmiten a los hijos, a los nietos y a las próximas generaciones. También, pues, a partir de las exposiciones que hemos escuchado en el día de hoy, destacamos el rol de las mujeres en la conservación de la medicina tradicional y ancestral. La hermana Anchana Soren nos decía que las mujeres indígenas son quienes custodian y mantienen, transmiten la lengua y las prácticas culturales asociadas a ella. Y en esto aprovecho para comentar la experiencia de Bolivia, pues en este momento complejo seguramente no solo Bolivia, sino también muchos países del mundo han tenido que utilizar la medicina tradicional, han utilizado la medicina de los pueblos indígenas para hacer frente a la pandemia de la COVID-19. En ese contexto, también en Bolivia se ha utilizado diferentes prácticas medicinales para enfrentar esta pandemia, porque finalmente varias instituciones del Estado en su momento abandonaron a los pueblos indígenas, y en ese marco pues se hizo uso de diferentes productos, de diferentes hierbas medicinales, de diferentes raíces para poder enfrentar esta pandemia. En ello destaco, además ya respaldado actualmente por estudios científicos, hay una planta, una raíz que es la huira, que ya tiene incluso el respaldo científico, un estudio realizado en el año 2020, desarrollado por la doctora Rodríguez Sequeira y con sus colaboradores y publicado por la revista Phytotherapy Research, confirma las propiedades las propiedades antivirales y los efectos inmunomodulatorios de la huira, que es una planta medicinal que justamente tienen los pueblos indígenas a lo largo de la región latinoamericana y caribeña. Así podemos destacar muchos otros ejemplos que a lo largo del planeta diferentes pueblos, diferentes naciones indígenas, nacionalidades indígenas han ido utilizando para justamente enfrentar esta pandemia que estamos viviendo, que aún no termina. Pues además de la salud, la importancia del conocimiento tradicional y ancestral puede evidenciarse en múltiples ámbitos, incluyendo la seguridad alimentaria, la lucha contra el cambio climático y la gestión de la biodiversidad. También quiero destacar en las exposiciones presentadas el día de hoy la importancia de revitalizar la lengua. La lengua de los pueblos indígenas no es solamente un instrumento de comunicación, no solamente es un medio para hablar con otras personas, sino la lengua es un elemento fundamental para la transmisión de conocimientos, para la transmisión de saberes de los pueblos indígenas. Y en eso también hago referencia al tema de que debemos fortalecer más la interculturalidad entre pueblos. Yo creo que la interculturalidad debe ser el elemento central para establecer un diálogo entre pueblos indígenas, pero también con otros pueblos no indígenas. Estamos en un tiempo donde tenemos que dialogar y construir entre los diferentes pueblos que habitamos sobre la madre tierra. Todas estas participaciones nos demuestran que necesitamos llevar adelante una verdadera agenda multilateral indígena, donde los estados mostremos compromiso con la plurinacionalidad y podamos canalizar las demandas y las propuestas para proteger y fortalecer el rol de las mujeres indígenas en la conservación del conocimiento, pero también en el diálogo intercientífico para el vivir bien de la humanidad. En esto creo que también debemos destacar que los diferentes espacios de las Naciones Unidas deben considerar que es importante que las mujeres indígenas se hayan sumado a las luchas generales de las mujeres. Hay reivindicaciones históricas de las mujeres en su conjunto, pero también hay particularidades de las mujeres indígenas, hay particularidades que deben ser abordadas específicamente en temas de mujeres indígenas. Creo que esas particularidades deben ser abordadas dentro de los diferentes espacios de las Naciones Unidas, como ya se lo hizo en el pasado año dentro de lo que fue el CSW, y creo que las otras instancias de Naciones Unidas también tienen que incorporar esta perspectiva. Dentro de los pueblos indígenas también tenemos el reto de poder construir la igualdad y la paridad entre mujeres y varones. Necesitamos que nuestras organizaciones indígenas, necesitamos que nuestras participaciones en foros internacionales también tengan una participación paritaria, donde mujeres y varones podamos expresar nuestras posiciones y de esa manera también se haga justicia con las mujeres que históricamente y doblemente han sido discriminadas. Ya para concluir esta breve presentación, pues que me gustaría poder reafirmar el compromiso de Bolivia de servir de interfaz entre los pueblos indígenas y los espacios multilaterales para seguir avanzando, impulsados por las luchas de los pueblos indígenas, en especial las mujeres indígenas por sus derechos y la madre tierra. Y en ese contexto, pues estamos iniciando el proceso de negociación de lo que va a ser la resolución de Naciones Unidas sobre los derechos de los pueblos indígenas para la Asamblea General de septiembre de 2022, y pues estamos también dispuestos a escuchar las propuestas que se vayan a generar desde la visión de las mujeres indígenas y desde la visión de los pueblos indígenas en general. Y en este día quiero, ya para terminar, felicitar a todas las hermanas, a todos los hermanos indígenas del mundo por este día, por su trabajo, por su contribución, y creo que la diversidad de culturas, la diversidad de pueblos, la diversidad de naciones ha hecho que nuestros estados cada vez sean más ricos culturalmente, pero además han hecho que este mundo sea un mundo más rico por la diversidad de culturas, por la diversidad de visiones, y eso ha fortalecido no solamente la democracia, los derechos humanos, sino la convivencia entre todas y todos. Con esto quiero terminar y muchas gracias, Rosemary, por brindarnos este espacio y también pues destaco la declaración realizada por el grupo de amigos de los pueblos indígenas que estará disponible en la plataforma para que todos puedan leerlo y todos puedan también conocer la posición que se ha expresado en esta declaración conjunta. Muchísimas gracias y muchas felicidades a todos los pueblos indígenas.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for being with us today, and I'd just like to acknowledge Bolivia's support for Indigenous peoples' rights at the UN, which is crucial and is greatly acknowledged by us and the Permanent Forum. That being said, earlier I mentioned we were talking about technology, the use of technology, and so we're actually going to try something new for us anyway, which is the Mentimeter. And so you'll see in the chat has just popped up a link. And we'd like to invite the audience connected from all over the world to have your say on today's discussion. And we're doing a screen share, I believe now. So we've arranged a Mentimeter word cloud to have a visual representation of your thoughts and reflections. And for all of you on this Zoom platform, just please log into the Mentimeter link or those of you not on the Zoom platform, you go to menti.com and enter the code 20224574. But otherwise, just go to the link in the chat box. And you'll see that the first question is, what are the challenges still faced by Indigenous women despite the existence of international human rights instruments? So if you respond with only 1 or 2 words, we should be able to see your responses as they come in live. And let's see what the audience respond. So it seems that the biggest words that we can read are the words that are most I'm just watching, are most popular and the responses. And it keeps moving. I see respect, poverty, discrimination, education. I don't know what anybody else is seeing. Respect, I think I said that. It's moving a lot, so I think it means that a lot of people are responding. Seeing, I think we will, oh, sexism, somebody said. Murdered Indigenous women. That's another one that's coming up. Racism, employment. There's lots of, and I think so, patriarchy. I think there are, so I think what will happen when we finish this, it will freeze and we'll be able to see at the end of the day what are the biggest, the most popular responses on this. But education and poverty are coming up very big. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next question. So invite you to answer the second question is, what tools or policies are needed to ensure the rights of Indigenous women? And so again, if you could respond with 1 or 2 words and we see what comes up. Listening platform, preservation of language, protection of rights, inclusivity, collective action, national legislation, sustainable energy, funding. It's quite an interesting tool, this, and I think we're going to analyze at the end of this, but there are many, many answers. Lands, it's like many different, wow, there are many answers to this one. So I think we're going to have to look at it at the end, but this is kind of an interesting experiment. The other thing we asked people to, in advance of this webinar, we asked people to send us videos, and you might have seen on social media, we've been asking you to share with us short videos on who is your inspiring Indigenous woman in time for the International Day. So we put together a short collection of these videos, which we're going to share now.
The Indigenous woman that inspires me is Chief Kayleen Sisk. She is a hereditary chief from the Winnemem-Wintu Nation, and she inspires me because she has inherited a dual role in her leadership capacity. She governs politically, and she also is the traditional healer for her people.
Una de las mujeres jóvenes que más me inspira y a quien le tengo en mi memoria y en mi corazón es a Cristina Bautista, una lideresa víctima del conflicto armado en Colombia, ex becaria del Fondo de Voluntarios y a quien la conocí en su lucha y en su compromiso.
My idol role model which inspired me a lot is Bam Kumari Buddha. She is Buddha Magar. She is the one who led the indigenous women's movement in Nepal. She is very, very strong and she has lots of knowledge on indigenous people and the movement.
Una de las mujeres indígenas a quien más admiro es mi mamá. Ella fue una persona que luchó mucho por los derechos de sus hijas, sobre todo fue una persona feminista que nos ha enseñado los valores de la comunidad, pero también el valor de defender los derechos de los demás. Mi mamá falleció hace 12 años y la extraño con mucho cariño por todo lo que nos ha dejado. Sus pasos siempre serán recordados por su familia y por todo el legado que ella nos deja.
An Indigenous woman who inspires me is Migdalia Taikeli Alicia, Taino woman, representative of the United Confederation of Taino People. She's been doing a lot of work within the UN system, focusing on Indigenous women's rights, but she's been consistent, she's been ongoing, she's been steadfast, and I'm just appreciate taking a moment to say, to acknowledge her in this work.
The inspiring Indigenous woman is the businesswoman because she's the one who gives herself to the duty of her own family.
My grandmother taught me a lot, and not only about tradition, culture, and the community, but she had this special talent of knowing about traditional, having a lot of knowledge about traditional knowledge. For me, it was important to learn that traditional knowledge is real, that it is very valuable, and that is really a part of our life. And I think that is very important for me as a woman, but also all other women, because they will transmit it to the youth.
So as we come to the end of our event today, and on behalf of the Indigenous Peoples and Development Branch in the Division for Inclusive Social Development at the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, I'd like to thank our invited speakers in today's panel session for an enriching discussion on this year's special theme. I would also like to thank all of you who've tuned in and participated in our discussions throughout the word cloud. Just before we conclude today's event, I would like to invite you to continue our discussion online. FAO and DESA, the Food and Agricultural Organization, and our department are jointly hosting a live Twitter chat from 11 to 12 o'clock New York time, and we'll be posting a question every 10 minutes throughout the hour relating to this year's theme. And we invite you to retweet your responses using the hashtags #WeAreIndigenous and Indigenous Day. For the English conversation, you can follow FAO Indigenous. And for the Spanish conversation, please follow UN for Indigenous. We hope this will be a lively online discussion, and we look forward to hearing from you. And so again, I would really like to thank, or we would like to thank, I would say our branch would like to thank all of you. And also Casey Camp Horinek for the traditional opening ceremony. We thank you, Madam, for participating, and the ambassador from the mission of Bolivia, and of course, our panelists. Thank you so much. I think it's really great to see so many women in one place. on this event today, just highlighting the role of Indigenous women and traditional knowledge. So I thank you very much. And that being said, have a good day, have a good evening, all of you. Thank you very much.